Keystone projects are overarching assignments which enable students to show mastery of broad areas of study corresponding to the program-specific objectives of the Bachelor of Theology degree. Students are required to complete all Keystone projects by the end of their final year. One of these Keystone projects is a lecture on a theme either drawn from one or more of the following areas in general studies, such as history, literature, science, comparative religion, or philosophy, or on a topic of personal interest to the student. This particular assignment is designed to fulfill the following two objectives, such that the student demonstrates, first, an appreciation of the role of Christianity, and especially of the Orthodox Church, in the historical, intellectual, and cultural development of mankind, and secondly, an understanding of the world around us from an Orthodox Christian perspective. The student selects a suitable topic in consultation with faculty members who work with the student in a mentoring capacity, helping him or her to refine the topic, to structure the lecture, to ensure a clarity of presentation, and to generate suitable audiovisual resources. Although the Keystone lecture is not intended to be specifically theological in nature, the student is expected to expound on his or her topic within the broader context of Orthodox theology and to set forth the ramifications of the topic for contemporary church life. This Keystone assignment also affords a student an excellent opportunity to demonstrate his or her communication skills, which he or she will be able to put to good use in the future when serving the church in a clerical or teaching capacity. So the title of Brother Jeffrey's lecture this evening, again, is What Has China to Do with Jerusalem? An Exploration of Orthodoxy in Chinese Philosophy. With that, I invite Brother Jeffrey to come to the podium to give his lecture.
Thank you, Father Photios, and thank you all the fathers for attending and for everyone else, and very grateful for this audience, and I hope you'll learn something from this lecture, because I certainly have learned a lot. So to start out, I want to tell a quick story. I was trying for my 10th time to pick up learning Chinese again. Just a habit that always sometimes, just falls off after a while, which is hard. But this time I was using flashcards, and I was trying to think of a good way to retain Chinese a bit better. So I thought, maybe instead of doing all these boring words like in flashcards, which I don't really remember, I would try to do some interesting phrases that maybe would be more memorable. So I was looking up on YouTube, I think, this lecture online mentioned this quote in Chinese. And I really liked it because it was kind of a tongue twister. It was also kind of short, but also very poetic. And I'll read it in Chinese, and you won't understand it, but that's the point. It says, 知人者智，自智者明，胜人者有力，自胜者强. And what it means is, to know others is wisdom, to know oneself is enlightenment, to conquer others is to prove one's force, to conquer oneself is superior. And this was a few years ago, but I was already learning a bit about orthodoxy, and I thought, whoa, that's a pretty good quote. It's very memorable, and it's coming from some source in Chinese. I don't know what, but that would be interesting to find out. And so I did some research, and I found out it was actually from this book called the Tao Te Ching, and I was like, oh, I've heard of that before. And it seems like it's all full of this sort of obscure poetry, but some of it seems really interesting. So that was my first exposure, first real exposure to an actual primary text of Chinese philosophy. It was, I haven't had much exposure in my life, actually, until recently. And that got me thinking, so if there's such an interesting and valid point in just this one poem in Chinese philosophy, what more is there? Potentially, there is more, right? Because if you think about China, it's one of the oldest civilizations in the world. It's one of the most populous nations now. They're one of the 3 civilizations to independently develop their own philosophy, along with the Hindu civilization and the Hellenic civilization. So there's really much, I guess, credence to this idea that potentially there is more to Chinese philosophy than many of us think nowadays, because we really don't know much about it. Even Chinese people don't know much about Chinese philosophy. But most importantly, if you think about famous figures like Bruce Lee saying, be like water, it's like, what does that mean? There must be more to it. So that's what led to this, not that specifically, but these ideas led to this presentation. What does China, to do with Jerusalem? An exploration of orthodoxy in Chinese philosophy. And when I say orthodoxy, I actually mean it in 2 ways in this subtitle. I mean orthodoxy as in the way we understand it, orthodoxy, true belief in the church, but also orthodoxy as in orthodoxa, like correct belief. What is the fundamental correct belief in Chinese philosophy? Because there are so many different interpretations of Chinese philosophy and different schools, and I was curious, what was the root of it all? as for the title, some of you might recognize that. It's from Tertullian. Now, Tertullian's a famous Latin church father of the, I think, 2nd century. And he essentially battled rhetorically against a lot of heretics who were also philosophers. And so he's kind of frustrated at some point. And he wrote with his usual spicy language, "What indeed has Athens to do with Jerusalem? What concord is there between the academy and the church? What between heretics and Christians? Away with all attempts to produce a modeled Christianity of Stoic, Platonic, and dialectic composition." And he's full of quotes like this, so he's a good read if you're ever curious. But what he means by Athens is Greek philosophy, ancient Greek philosophy. And what he means by Jerusalem is the church. So these are metaphors. And he's saying there really should be no mingling between these because that just creates heresy. And this question actually is an important question. And the church worked with it in its development over the centuries after Tertullian. And you can see certain church fathers preferred one direction and certain church fathers preferred another direction. Some liked philosophy more than others. Some totally just didn't want any of it in their writings. But eventually the church came to a consensus, which was that there was stuff in philosophy that was valid and useful for the church, but also you just need to, get rid of the bad stuff. That's in a nutshell what happened. So in exploring Chinese philosophy, we're going to, in this presentation, try to cover the two main native philosophies of China, which are the two big ones that people have probably heard of, Confucianism and Taoism. There's others out there, but they're much smaller. And then there's also Buddhism, which was a foreign religion that eventually became, you could say, Chineseified after a few centuries. So first, we'll talk about Confucianism. And I just want to do a quick survey. When you see Confucianism, what are one or two words that you can think of? And I'll just choose 2 or 3 people from the audience just to get an impression of what the general idea is of Confucianism. If anyone feels comfortable to raise their hands, and I'll just repeat it out loud so you don't need a microphone. If you just want to say something out loud, come on, someone. What comes to mind? You don't have to know it really. Simeon.
I know it's like a set of rules set about by a Chinese philosopher named Confucius, and he makes certain doctrines regarding ethics and morals and also etiquette concerning society.
Okay, very good. That's a lot more than 2 words, but I'll take it. You'll count for everyone else because everyone's being shy. So rules for morals, ethics, government. Yeah, that's the general impression of Confucianism. And I don't blame them. That's really explicit in the text if you read it. But what I tried to do was read the primary text itself with my rudimentary Chinese and classical Chinese and try to understand more of it. So first, we'll talk about these general virtues, which you see throughout Confucian texts. These are the things that people always talk about when they talk about Confucianism. As you see, you might recognize some things that Simeon said. There's the idea of righteousness, filial piety, which is essentially how to act between father, son, mother and son, brother and brother. There's different rules for relationships. There's goodness, there's propriety, which is how to act in society and in certain situations in the government. There's wisdom, so the focus on learning, and then there's sincerity. So yeah, I'm just giving a smattering of these broad ideas, these virtues that we can accept. I mean, they're generally good moral principles, and we see these in general Confucian teachings. But when I was reading through the text, I noticed there's an interesting pattern. And you'll see here on the top left, a quote. It says, "The master, Confucius, says, a transmitter and not a maker, believing in and loving the ancients, I venerate to compare myself with her old Pang." So we don't know who that exactly is, but at least the part of the quote where he says he's loving the ancients. In the bottom left, "In the ways prescribed by the ancient kings, this is the excellent quality, and in things small and great, we follow them." So he's saying we follow the ancient kings. Okay, that's more interesting. Then he says in the top right, "The master said, I am not one who was born in the possession of knowledge. I am one who is fond of antiquity and earnest in seeking it there. So again, another reference to antiquity. And then lastly, on the bottom right, "The master said, even in my early days, a historiography would leave a blank in his text," and so on, so on. What he means by that is he's actually fond of the days, which were not too long ago, when people who wrote down history were very strict with themselves, and if they were uncertain about history, they wouldn't write it down because it would be wrong to create some falsehood in their texts. So this shows Confucius had a reverence for history. He had a reverence for some ancients that we don't really know, that are obscure at this point for a beginner reader, and that he's very interested in the truth, having true things and correct things in history. So we'll just put that aside for now, and we'll move on to Taoism. I'm just giving you overviews right now, and then we'll move into them more deeply. So does anyone want to put forth any random ideas they have about Taoism when they think of it? Professor Chairman? Yeah.
Doesn't it mean the way?
The way. Okay, good. Oh, Father Gregory?
Yin and yang.
Yin and yang. Okay. So the way, yin and yang, yes, these are ideas that people might associate if they don't really know too much about Taoism, but they are certainly connected with the general Chinese philosophical culture. I'll give you what I found just reading like what people generally talk about Tao, what they say. First of all, yes, if you see in the red box, that's the Chinese word for Tao. In Chinese, it's pronounced Dao. And it can mean many different things: way, road, path, saying, truth, technique. And yes, it has some overlap with the idea of logos. And well, we'll maybe see more about that later. There's also these two main concepts that come up again that people really attach to, at least in some point in Chinese history. They're called non-action, wu wei, and simplicity, pu. And they both kind of go together. They're about this sort of primitive living, sort of natural living, not trying hard to do anything, the sort of idyllic life. And that's what a lot of people in early Chinese history after the time of Christ, they picked up on Taoism and they followed that style of Taoism, in that they sort of went off and sat by a river with their friends and wrote poems spontaneously and drank wine and laughed at all the court ministers who were Confucian and ritual people and, and made fun of them, essentially. So that's one conception of Tao. And this painting here actually depicts something of that line. We see this smiling guy in the bottom. He's fishing and enjoying himself. And these two court ministers come to recruit him to the court. And he's essentially, he just rejects them. He's like, why would I do that? I'd rather sit here and enjoy nature like a turtle in the mud. And it's like a parable in one of the Taoist schools. So that painting's depicting that. So that's one of the main impressions of Taoism. And that's just what people think. But again, I was reading through the Taoist texts, the poems, and I noticed there's a similar pattern as we saw in Confucius. On the top left, we see a quote: "When we can lay hold of the Tao of old to direct the things of the present day and are able to know it as it was of old in the beginning, this is called the unwinding the clue of Tao." Okay, so again, that's the same word in Chinese, which is gu. So it's talking about the same idea of the ancient times. In the bottom right and the bottom left, it says, "That saying of the ancients that XYZ was not vainly spoken. All real completion is comprehended under it." Now, we don't really understand what that means, but again, he's mentioning ancients. And on the right-hand side, we have this quote that says, "The skillful masters of the Tao in old times." So just pointing out this pattern again. They're using this word ancient, and they're referring to these masters, these people who essentially they're just trying to transmit the ideas of. And I thought, well, if we want to get down to the root of Chinese philosophy, we've got to find out who these ancients were. And that's when I found out about the Shang Shu. So that's what it sounds like in Chinese. You can call it Shang Shu, I guess English. These are court documents that date back to describing the court all the way back in 2300 BC. And just for your reference, that's before the time of Abraham, the patriarch Abraham. So these are really interesting documents that somehow were preserved. And there's a really, it's a miraculous preservation if you consider how many times in Chinese history the new emperor just burned all the historical books from the past. So these were preserved. They were very important to the sages, the people who kept the knowledge. And there's some doubt about, about the dating of its writing. And some scholars say at the earliest it could have been like around 1000 BC that was written. But actually there's strong evidence that already from the 2000 BCs in the courts, there was already a position, official position of recorder that was like very important, a historical recorder who would write down everything, and that over the centuries, this position was always maintained, and that they would sort of sift through and keep the things that were sort of key points of wisdom and pass them down. And it's not improbable to think that people were making copies, and therefore if a copy can only be dated to a certain time, that doesn't necessarily mean that the actual text is not older than that. So this is a very ancient text, and it was a good starting point. So we'll look at this text, at some examples of it, to try to understand the context of these ancient Chinese philosophies, to see where are they coming from. They're all drawing from these ancients. So maybe this will give us a clue as to what ancients were thinking about. So the first book in the Shang Shu is about the first emperor, Yao, and that's the Chinese character for his name. And he was the first emperor of China. And there's a description of him in the introduction. I won't read it all, but we can just see the bold words. He was reverential, intelligent, accomplished, and thoughtful. The display of these qualities extended from earth to heaven. He was able to make the able and virtuous distinguished, and all the people of his kindred became harmonious, and there was universal concord. So that's just in a nutshell that quote. So what we're drawing from here are these bold terms, just to get the idea of the context that we're in. This is a kingdom and an empire already at that time, probably really small though, but they were focused on these ideas of virtue, on reverence, on harmony and universal concord. So we get a basic sense of what their government was like. Next, we get the second emperor, his name, Shun in Chinese. And the description says he was mild and respectful and entirely sincere. The report of his mysterious virtue was heard on high, and he was appointed to occupy the imperial seat. Now, the story of how he came to be emperor is funny because the Emperor Yao noticed his virtue. Someone brought to his attention, and he tested him for many years. And then he said, "Come, you, Shun, I have consulted you on all affairs and examined your words and found that your words can be carried into practice. Now for 3 years, do you ascend the imperial throne?" But Shun wished to decline in favor of someone more virtuous and not to consent to become successor. So this is a striking example. We don't see many times in history. He's invited to this position of emperor, but he actually declines because he's not virtuous enough. So what were they thinking back then? These ancients, they had this idea of virtue, and this emperor clearly had a lot of humility. But eventually he was forced to do it, so. Then we have the third emperor, Yu, and the story is the same. So Yu is also a very virtuous minister under Shun. And then this time Shun is telling him, "Come, Yu, he says, I'm between 90 and 100 years old. I don't even know how old I am. Old." And he says, "Do you, eschewing all indolence, take leadership of my people? So take my position, please." And Yu says, "My virtue is not equal to the position. The people will not repose in me. But there's someone else. Think of him. He's virtuous." So this is an interesting, I never saw this before. And so these emperors essentially were selected based on their virtue, but at the same time, because of their virtue, they didn't want to ascend the throne. And they were only essentially forced or coerced into it for the sake of the people. Now, to learn more about this, we'll look a bit about their government. And so this is the ancient Chinese government. And there's just some quotes I picked out that sort of speak to the main themes that the government talked about. One of them is, there are the rectification of the people's virtue in speaking about the rules of the government. So we see here explicitly said, the government is supposed to help develop the people's virtue, aside from all the physical sustenance and supporting them. So, and in Chinese, that's called 正德. De on the right-hand side, that character, that's virtue. 正 means to correct or make upright. So it's a valid translation. I checked them. Some other quotes. In the left one, Shun is talking to to Yu, who was his advisor of law or legal advisor at the time, and he was praising him because through his system of punishment, there may come to be no punishment. So Yu, we don't know what it was, but he was developing a punishment system that was essentially creating reformation in the people being punished, so such that eventually it would get rid of punishment, which is a very high understanding of punishment that, again, we don't see in many places in ancient history. Again, on the right, a sovereign must be careful about his personal cultivation. This is from an advisor to the emperor. In Chinese, personal cultivation is called 修身, which means literally fixing body, but shen can also mean fixing self. But it's interpreted as personal cultivation. And this, in this quote, is talking about the sovereign. So the emperor himself must be watchful about his own personal cultivation, which makes sense, because if you want to cultivate other people, you must be cultivated yourself in terms of virtue. So again, fascinating. About that cultivation, we have this idea of 9 virtues. In Chinese, it's called 九德. So 九 means number 9. I won't read all of them because the problem is in these ancient translations, we actually don't know the exact connotations of the words, even though the words might have been passed down even through the shifting morphologies of the characters themselves. The exact definitions are hard to pin down. So that's close enough. That's just by an Oxford Protestant scholar who's very good at translating, well recognized. So we can accept that as a rough translation. But the idea I wanted to point out here is just in summary, they had the system of 9 virtues already. And it seems like the virtues are in a form of contraries or upholding some sort of unity between seemingly contrary ideas. So this is kind of reminds me of Aristotle's doctrine of the mean, but this was back in what, 2300 something BC or somewhere around that time. So they had these idea of virtues, and also I didn't include this in the quote, but about these 9 virtues, they have a system where they say, and I don't think this was a very strict, rigid system, but if you have 3 of these 9 virtues, you're fit enough to rule your family. If you have 6 of these, you're fit enough to rule your locality. If you have 9 of these, you're fit enough to be a high government official or an emperor. So they had a system of recognition that you need more virtues to take on more responsibility. Now, there's also a lot about the Tao in these Shang Shu, and you wouldn't think, I thought, you know, the Taoist text was the one that invented the idea of Tao, but no, the Tao actually goes all the way back to this time. It was taken from these ancient books, it seems like. So in this quote, just look at the red. This is advice to the emperor again from an advisor who says, "Do not go against what is right to get the praise of the people." And that's the translation from the Oxford Scholar. But if you actually look at the Chinese text, and I see his reason for abbreviating it, but the actual words are yuan dao. So the word Tao is in there. And the word before it means to become distant from it or to stray from it. So it's actually saying, do not stray from the way to get the praise of the people. So it's you know, this is a very basic idea, like don't sell yourself out as emperor, essentially. At the bottom, I bolded an interesting part of that quote as well. If you do all these things, all these virtuous acts, which he's advising, the barbarous tribes will come and acknowledge your sovereignty. So this advisor is saying, don't try to conquer by force. Try to conquer by virtue, essentially. Try to be a good person, and everyone will submit to you. So we're starting to see some of these basic sort of ethos of this ancient Chinese government, which was focused on virtue, which was focused on essentially conquering by peace, which is an interesting idea. More on the Tao, there's this quote I really liked. In Chinese, 人心为微, 道心为微. It's very poetic too in sound. The first part says, the heart of man is dangerous, or it can also mean precarious or uneasy. The second line says, the heart of the way, or the heart of the Tao, is gentle, minute, or delicate. So reinforcing our ideas that they want to emphasize the Tao as opposed to man. But this also is a very explicit opposition, which reminded me of St. Paul talking about walking in the spirit versus walking in the flesh. That's the connotation I got from as an Orthodox. Now, even more about the Tao. There's an advisor talking to Emperor Shun, or no, Emperor Yu, and he's describing what Emperor Shun did, and he's saying that, in the red, it is virtue which moves heaven, there is no distance to which it does not reach, pride brings loss, and humility receives increase. This is the way of heaven. So when I saw that, I opened my eyes. I was like, way of heaven? What are they talking about? Way of heaven. But yes, it's in the Chinese, and they're talking about humility is the way of heaven. And again, this is in the context of he's advising him how to deal with barbarous tribes who are causing trouble. If you look at those characters in Chinese, Tian Dao, we already know Dao is the way. Tian means heaven, so way of heaven. It's pretty clear. You can't really get it wrong. So then I was curious about heaven, so I was scanning the text for things about heaven, and we find this description of Shun. Remember the second emperor who was forced to become emperor even though he thought he wasn't worthy? Well, in the early time of his emperorship, he daily cried with tears to compassionate heaven, taking to himself and bearing all guilt and evil. What was this guy doing? What was Emperor Shun doing, bearing guilt and evil? I mean, this is a concept that we can understand as Christians, which is to take on the sins of others, but that's a very tough responsibility. That's a very high spiritual idea, and somehow he was doing something similar to that, and you know, it doesn't explain any more than that, but as Orthodox Christians, we can at least appreciate what that might mean. And one of his advisors sees him and is moved by his example and says, entire sincerity moves spiritual beings. Unfortunately, there's so much ambiguity in that text, but at least we can get the idea that he was moved by the example, and he noticed that Emperor Shun was being very sincere in his seeming repentance towards heaven. Even more, there's a quote from another advisor who says, it is heaven which is all intelligent and observing. Let the sage king take it as his pattern. And that's what the Chinese says. And so what I want to note from this slide is heaven is an example. It's a model that a king can take and presumably people can follow, and that this pattern will help you govern well. So that, again, we can accord with that we follow the principles of heaven, of God, then things will go well. Now, I was curious, heaven is usually linked to God, so I was curious what they said about God explicitly in these ancient Chinese texts. This one emperor, later down the line, he was saying, I was respectfully and silently thinking of the right way. He uses the word Tao again, so you see it's repeated a lot. And he says, I dreamt that God gave me a good assistant who would speak for me. He then minutely described the appearance of the person and caused search to be made. And he actually found this advisor, who was the advisor who said the previous quote. So this is attested to in the annals of history, that we don't really know what it means that God appeared to him, manifested to him, but he actually did say this happened, and then he found an advisor. And what was the advisor? The advisor was in this region, this mountainous region, just in the mountains, like a recluse, like a hermit. And he found him and sort of persuaded him to become an advisor, which is, you know, a tough responsibility, but with the idea that he would be able to help develop the virtues in the people. And so this was a good calling, and the advisor conceded. And there is also another example, and probably more than I read, of emperors going in search of advisors, like very desperately, for advisors who could teach them and cultivate them in virtue, and actually like, kind of like a Geronda in a monastery, like even do mean things to them just to teach them a lesson. The emperors actually wanting that from their advisors. And so remember we saw that idea about repentance. Here's another example. This is from a speech from the Emperor Tang. He's around 1750 BC, so it's still quite old. And he just conducted a revolt against the corrupt and decaying emperor to revive it, essentially, for good reason, arguably. And he's giving a speech to the people to keep good morals, follow his statutes, follow his lead. And he's saying something quite thought-provoking. He's saying, of the evil in me, I dare not forgive myself. I will examine these things in harmony with the mind of God. So he's confessing his evils. He's confessing that he has evils in him and he won't hide them. He'll try to purge them himself by consulting with God. And he says also, when guilt is found anywhere in you who occupy the myriad regions, it must rest on me. So again, this idea, he's taking on guilt from all his people. Why would you do that if you didn't have a higher understanding of this guilt of responsibility for people? It would just seem like you're committing spiritual suicide, or, you know, why would you be taking on needless guilt if you don't need to? So this is a high understanding of what seems like repentance that he's talking about. And sorry I have to move fast, but there's just so much interesting stuff in there. I think one of the last ones I'll go over, this is actually from a different book, the Standard Annals of History. It's talking about Emperor Tang, and it goes with that past quote I just showed you. There was a famine in his early reign, and sufferings of people were intense, and some people suggested, ignorantly, that a human being should be offered in sacrifice. This emperor said, if a man must be the victim, then I will be. So he fasted and then put on the guise of a sacrificial victim, went to a grove of mulberry trees, which is, in Chinese culture, it's always been associated with death. Mulberry trees are like mourning and death. And he prayed there and asked if this was due to any problem in his government, essentially. And then during his prayer, rain fell over several thousand li, which is, the actual distance is unknown, but we can just think of it as miles. So it fell over a large area immediately and ended the drought. So as I both had fasted and prayed, it's quite a parallel to what we know about our prayer to God. So that was the Shang Shu, and now we'll move into the Tao Te Ching with this new view, this new context in mind of what these ancients were talking about. And hopefully with that context in mind, we can understand some of the more strange or ambiguous concepts in the Tao Te Ching, because the problem with the Tao Te Ching is it's poetic, and it's also very, it's got a lot of ambiguities, and so people can interpret it whatever way they want. And so as we saw, some Chinese people interpret it as go live out, you know, along the riverside and go eat, you know, eat fish and live idyllically and don't care about government. And that's how they interpreted the Tao. And some people interpreted Tao as there are these immortals that, like in a Buddhist way, like you can become an immortal who like wanders the earth and can become a dragon and stuff like that. So there's a lot of ambiguity in there. But I was hoping that with the Shang Shu, with the context of ancient history, we can actually understand what they're referring to when they keep talking about ancients and use it as like a hermeneutics, as a way of interpreting the Tao. So this first quote you'll find familiar. This is what I started out my presentation with. To know others is wisdom. To know oneself is enlightenment. To conquer others is to prove one's force. To conquer oneself is superior. He who knows contentment is wealthy. He who has superior conduct has aspiration. He who does not neglect his position abides long. He who dies without perishing has longevity or life. And that kind of took a pause for a second for me. I was like, what does he mean by that? And the translations all struggle with this. And it is actually quite common that a Taoist poem will present a lot of dichotomies and then it will resolve them or give a final wrapping in the end line that's extremely ambiguous. It's really frustrating. But that's the best I could translate it based on all the translations that I was reading. And us Christians, we can understand it, and we could perhaps not be wrong in assuming that we know exactly what he's talking about, which is this idea that the Byzantines knew, an pethanis prin pethanis, then tha pethanis otan pethanis. If you die before you die, you won't die when you die. So this is a fun saying. It refers to essentially dying or mortifying yourself to the world and rejecting the world such that you're not held or bound by any passions when you die. So your soul is truly free when you actually die, and you're actually fully alive in that sense. So this is a deep Christian ascetical understanding, but we potentially see it in here, and I would argue it's supported by a lot of these sort of ascetical themes that we see in the Taoist text, which we'll see more of this focus on the inner self, the conquering oneself. There's another poem. This talks about the theme of humility, which I also saw recurrent many, many times in the Tao Te Ching in many poems. So it reads, when a superior scholar hears the way, he puts it into action. When an average scholar hears the way, it may abide or perish. When an inferior scholar hears the way, he ridicules it. If it were not ridiculed so much, how could it be the way? Hence these words of advice. The brightness of the way seems dark. The nearness of the way seems to retreat. The smoothness of the way seems like a knot. Superior virtue is like a valley. Its becoming known is like humiliation. So this is, again, he's playing on these distinctions and dichotomies, that the way is actually more difficult than it seems. It's not as simple as it seems. And actually, if you want to be really virtuous, it's actually humiliation. There's humility involved. And when, immediately we think of Christ, who is the source of humility, and we participate in his humility, and that is actually, as many of the church fathers and desert fathers say, humility is the virtue that sustains all other virtues. So there's a superiority to humiliation and humility that was recognized in this poem. And we'll see another one. On humility again, this is a very short poem. It says, what is twisted shall be straightened, the wrong shall be rehabilitated, lowlands shall be filled, the worn out shall be renewed, the needy shall receive, the plentiful shall be confused. The sage, not seeking his own merit, has accomplishments, not regarding himself as great, becomes foremost. So again, there's a dichotomy. The sage, in this case, describing people who are very virtuous, essentially, to the utmost. We can liken it to the idea of saints, but that would be anachronistic. The sage doesn't regard himself as great, but becomes foremost. So the humble person becomes greatest. And we understand this, as Christ says, take the last seat. He who is greatest takes the last seat and serves the others. And this idea, again, lowland shall be filled, I bolded that because it goes with the idea from the previous poem about the highest virtue is like a valley. But this one's saying lowland shall be filled. So there's some sort of expectation that the humble will be redeemed in their humility. And I don't know if anyone recognized it, but it's certainly very striking. If you think about Isaiah 40, every valley shall be exalted and every mountain and hill shall be made low, and the crooked shall be made straight and the rough places plain, and the glory of the Lord shall be revealed and all flesh shall see it together. I don't think I can get closer as that. Well, very striking. So apophaticism. This is another theme that I noticed in certain poems. Of course, it's extremely difficult to translate, especially with such an ambiguous style as poetic style. In this poem it says, the grandest place has no borders. The largest vessel takes long to fill. The loudest voice is sparsely heard. The greatest resemblance is without form. The Tao is hidden and nameless, yet is it not the Tao alone which charitably forgives and even perfects? So we see in lines 11 to 14 this, again, this contraries, this playing on contraries. You think that you know what the greatest thing is, but it's actually beyond your conception. It's actually reverse, essentially. So it's this idea of paradox that we're comfortable with as Orthodox Christians, but I'm sure many people reading this, especially like the Zen Buddhists who tend to interpret the Taoist text in their own way, they totally, well, in my opinion, they mutilate the idea very badly. But we can understand it at least a bit better with our theology. Now, obviously, the key line is line 15, the Tao is hidden and nameless. Okay, that's a very basic statement, and we can accept that this sort of apophaticism of namelessness, ineffability, of being not explicitly revealed, unlike other cultures which have religions where you're revering like a pagan idol or something like that. Ancient Chinese history actually never had an image of their god. They were always sort of imageless. They talked about God, they talked about heaven, and there was a God and heaven were pretty much synonymous. But they had a very similar Christian understanding. I mean, Jewish understanding, I would say. They didn't depict God. They understood that God is not worshipped in physical manner, like as a physical statue or something, not as like a powerful king. And line 16 was interesting. It's one of those wrapping up lines that's pretty much impossible to translate. But when it says, which charitably forgives and even perfects, the word for forgive, dai, actually has many connotations. Forgive, pardon, mercy, bearing responsibility. And I actually notice if you look at all those together, it's very close to hadis in Greek, ancient Greek, this idea of grace having sort of a broad umbrella of different meanings. But that's just something I came across that I thought I'd note. It's not very conclusive. And then I thought perhaps the best way to look at apophaticism is the famous first poem, the introductory poem, kind of like Psalm 1 of the Psalter. It's supposed to be easy, right? Because it's introducing readers to the Taoist text, but no, this is the hardest one. It says, the Tao that can be spoken of is not the unchanging Tao. The name that can be named is not the unchanging name. The unnamed is the beginning of heaven and earth. Named is the origin of all things. Hence, with a constant lack of desires of things, one can see its mystery, but with constant desires of things, one can only see its fringe. These two aspects emerge together but receive various names. They are deemed the same, a mystery. Mystery upon mystery, the door to a host of mysteries. So don't try to understand that right now. It'll take you probably a long time. We don't have enough time for that. But and I don't understand it still. But I saw some basic ideas which we could understand from an Orthodox perspective. The first line, obviously, this ineffability of the Tao. If we liken the Tao to God, I mean, we have to hold these things. We have to be able to hold them in our mind without confirming them in our mind. Which is difficult to do, but that allows us to play with these ideas and to interpret this text more freely. So if we interpret Tao as some sort of, logos or God, it makes sense. It's ineffable. It's not named technically. We don't name the essence of God. We name his energies. And if you see, unnamed is the beginning of heaven and earth, named is the origin of all things. So there's a distinction. This thing is unnamed in one sense, but also named in another sense as the origin of all things. And in line 3 it says, or line 4 it says they emerge together. So they're one thing essentially. They emerge together as one thing, but they receive various names, and it's a mystery. So we can agree that yes, God is a mystery, and certainly is a mystery upon mystery. And this poem acknowledges that, and so we can appreciate the apophatic reverence for this principle which they're talking about. Now, there's another idea that we Orthodox Christians might be familiar with, which is the idea of knowledge. We believe that human knowledge is limited. It's finite. It's essentially vain in the end, but it helps us achieve true knowledge of God, which is participation in God. So true knowledge is actually beyond human knowledge. And we'll see if this idea is in the Tao as well, in the Tao Te Ching. This poem says, not leaving the household, yet knowing all under heaven. Not peering out a window, yet seeing the way of heaven. The further distance one travels, the less one knows. Thus, sages do not travel but know, do not see but understand, do not act but accomplish. So this might be familiar to some of us because if you read some of the Desert Fathers, they'll talk about this idea of stay in your cell and just pray, and that's pretty much what you should do. And that's like the bare bones desert monasticism. But it really does sound similar to this idea of you don't need to travel out and go learning things to gain true knowledge. True knowledge is actually inner. It's within yourself. And this idea is actually repeated by the Church Fathers. In this example from St. Isaac the Syrian, but quoted from St. Justin, for the man with a pure mind, the realm of the spirit is within himself. A man cannot see the beauty that is within himself until he has discounted and despised all the beauty that is outside of him. What's this referring to is essentially human knowledge and human affairs scatter our soul, essentially, scatter our nous across different areas, and we're essentially always focused on all the things of the world. But if we draw ourselves inward through prayer and pray, with an honest attention and with heart, then we are supposed to see the beauty that's inside of us. And obviously the prerequisite for this is purification. So this is what St. Isaac is getting at. But this is an ascetic ideal that's mentioned in a lot of our church fathers, in the Desert Fathers, and we see a parallel in the Taoist texts. And so it seems like they understood that, and there's more poems too that talk about knowledge, that it seems like they understand that there's a higher knowledge than human knowledge, which is very unique, I think, in ancient philosophies. So after that round of the Tao Te Ching, we'll move on to Confucius and his 4 books, which are considered essentially the canon for passing down the sayings of Confucius and expounding upon them and commentating on them. And so these range from 500, 300 BC. And we'll do the same exercise, finding quotes that we can understand from an Orthodox perspective and also using the way of the ancients that we saw earlier. So Mencius says at one point, to nourish the heart, there's nothing better than to make the desires few. So we have an idea of passions, and here he's talking about desires, and I'd argue that they're synonymous. And he's talking about nourishing the heart is making your passions few. First of all, this means that he understands the heart as in a sort of spiritual way, or some sort of, I guess, higher way that we could put it, that's not physical, because he's saying that making desires few nourishes the heart. How would anyone understand that unless they were understanding it from the true Christian perspective of the soul? In the second quote, Confucius talks about certain passions appearing at certain times, at certain ages of a person. He says, these are the 3 things which the superior man guards against. In youth, when the physical powers are not yet settled, he guards against lust. When he is strong and the physical powers are full of vigor, he guards against quarrelsomeness. When he's old and the animal powers are decayed, he guards against covetousness. So we don't know, we could argue that, the appropriateness of each of these, but, he obviously, this would depend on the person, but at the very least, we see that there's a sequence. There's a deeper understanding to passions, to, I guess, temptations that varies based on one's age. So it's a dynamic understanding of temptation, of passion, that's more than just do good, be a good person, be righteous, be a person who's good to your family. It's actually a lot deeper, and we see this in the Analects even, which is the direct sayings of Confucius. Now, more on this idea of cultivating the self. Confucius says, what the superior man seeks is in himself. What the mean man seeks is in others. And one might say, okay, there's many ways to understand that. One way is the interior, focus on the interior self, as we saw in the Tao Te Ching. Another way is, in the bottom quote, it kind of expands on it from Mencius. He says, the disease of men is this, that they neglect their own fields and go to weed the fields of others, and that what they require from others is great, while what they lay upon themselves is light. So this is talking about the passion of judgment. And I think it's spot on, and it kind of expounds on the first quote. And just so you know, I forgot to mention, Mencius is actually one of the most famous followers of Confucius, and he expands on all of his sayings, essentially, written and unwritten sayings. So we see they have an understanding of judgment too, judgmentalism, and they say that's like a very pervasive problem. Even more on cultivation. One of his disciples, of Confucius's disciples, called Zilu, is asking him what's a superior man. And Confucius says the cultivation of himself in reverential carefulness. And so he says, is this all? And Confucius says he cultivates himself so as to give peace to others. And then his disciple doesn't understand, so then he repeats it again. And then he says, even Yao and Shun were solicitous about this. So there's the reference to the first 2 Chinese emperors, Yao and Shun, and saying that this is what they were doing. They were cultivating themselves, but for what purpose? The purpose was to give peace to all the people. So there's a higher goal to this, which is to help their own people. That's the goal of this cultivation. It's not just the end of itself. So there's a higher meaning to the act of cultivating oneself as well. And the bottom quote, the master says, the determined scholar and the man of virtue will not seek to live at the expense of injuring goodness. That word can also mean compassion or virtue or love. They will even sacrifice their lives to preserve it. And this is a unique part, and that's why I quoted it. The idea of sacrificing one's life for a higher principle, like a virtue of goodness or love or compassion, that's, I thought that was very unique to Christianity, but clearly here he's saying explicitly, don't be afraid. They will even sacrifice their life to preserve it. And this means that, Confucius never explicitly talks about life after death, but this implies that he understood that there was something greater than this life, and that it's worthwhile to preserve higher principles. But that's as far as we can get with his explicit sayings on that idea specifically. Now remember heaven. We'll see what Confucius had to say about heaven. At one point he says he's being persecuted by someone. He says, heaven produced the virtue that is in me. Huan Tui, a persecutor, what can he do to me? There's a few ideas in here. One is that heaven is sort of an agent in this sentence. It produced the virtue that's in me. So it shows heaven produced his virtue, but also he shows his humility. He's saying, I'm not I'm not virtuous as a result of my own works. It's produced in me by heaven. So this is the idea of heaven that acts. It's not just this sort of inanimate thing, the sky, or many scholars say it doesn't do anything. It's just a principle that they talk about, that they even sort of create idols out of and stuff. So they really diminish the idea of heaven in Chinese philosophy. But I think this sentence is a counter argument to that idea. In the second quote, it says, in the book of poetry, before the sovereigns of the Yin dynasty had lost the hearts of people, they could appear before God. Take warning from the house of Yin. The great decree is not easily preserved. So I was curious what they meant, they could appear before God. And thank God, the Oxford translator had read a lot of commentaries, and the general understanding, the ancient Chinese understanding of this was they would conduct sacrifices. The emperor conducts sacrifices as sort of the priest for the nation. And they had some way of telling if they were pure enough that God accepted their sacrifice. Now, we don't know what exactly that method was, but they had this idea that you had to be purified before sacrifice, and then you'd sacrifice an animal, and then God would either approve of it or not. And usually the sacrifice was obviously for wrongdoing. So this, it's has a lot of parallels with our Jewish, the Jewish understanding of sacrifice, sacrificing animals, but also purification before sacrifice. Again, another very unique point. Now, remember when I said the Tao was not unique to the Tao Te Ching? Well, Confucius talks about it a lot too. He says at one point, in the Doctrine of the Mean, this is one of his, the students essentially wrote down his sayings on this principle. What heaven has conferred is called nature. In accordance with this nature is called the way. Cultivation of the way is called instruction. So there's a lot more to this framework that's expanded on, because this is just the first line of the Doctrine of the Mean. But what we can see here and take note of is there's a nature which they take, and actually the word means like what you have from birth. Your basic attributes from birth is your nature. In accordance with this nature is called the way. So you're supposed to use your nature and cultivate and follow the way. And that way you can hopefully instruct others and instruct yourself as you do that. More on the Tao. In the Doctrine of the Mean, a few lines down, it says, while there are no stirrings of pleasure, anger, sorrow, or joy, the mind may be said to be in the state of equilibrium. When those feelings have been stirred and they act in balance, there ensues what there may be called the state of harmony. This equilibrium is the great root from which grow all the human actings in the world, and this harmony is the universal path which they all should pursue. And if you recall that idea about self-cultivation, about conquering your inner self, about the passions, then with that context in mind, this actually makes a lot more sense. Without it, it sounds really crazy. But essentially, from my interpretation, the first equilibrium, where there's no states of all these emotions, is like the blanks. It's like the potential, the potential of a human heart. It has all the feelings potentially inside of it. And then it gets stirred by the senses. And so these senses stir the feelings. But if these feelings are cultivated such that they're controlled and act in balance with each other in terms of like the Doctrine of the Mean, they're not too much one way or too much the other, then there's a harmony. And that harmony is the universal path. It's the Tao that they should pursue. So again, there's an Orthodox quote that I think is in accordance with this. Abba Isaiah from the Ever-Getting-Nos says, in the beginning, when God created man, he placed him in paradise with sound senses established in their natural state. But when man accepted the counsel of the devil who deceived him, all of his senses were distorted from their natural state into a state contrary to nature. So it's talking in our Orthodox language of how we understand it, which is much more detailed. But this seeming Chinese understanding, ancient Chinese philosophy, seems to talk about the same thing, just with different words of equilibrium and harmony. And they seem to have an understanding of a more natural state and also a balanced state. And the last quote is just a short one. Mencius said, he who has developed his heart fully knows his nature. Knowing his nature, he knows heaven. So this is directly connecting knowing one's own self, knowing nature, as knowing heaven. Of course, it's not expounded upon, so I wish it was, but this connection is quite important because it's only really, as far as I've learned in the Orthodox dogma, that human nature is created in the image of God. And that's the idea, I think, that we could get from this if we interpret it in the true way. And as I said, there's many different ways to interpret this, but thanks to our Orthodox phronema, our mindset, and also thanks to the Shang Shu, these ancient antiquity court documents, we can actually, with those two supporting ideas, we can more confidently assert the truth in these statements through our own interpretation from the Orthodox perspective. So that's the last of that lightning round of ancient Chinese philosophy. And I want to return to that question again, but this time phrased more simply. What has ancient Chinese philosophy to do with orthodoxia, as in true opinion, as what we know as the truth? Well, my answer after all this research is yes. But a teacher would probably tell me, Brother Jeffrey, you have to explain that. So, all right, I'll try to explain it in things I learned from this school. One way to explain it is from St. Justin, philosopher, who talks a lot about philosophy. He says, "I will tell you, said I, what seems to me, for philosophy is, in fact, the greatest possession and most honorable before God, to whom it leads us and alone commends us. What philosophy is, however, and the reason why it has been sent down to men have escaped the observation of most. For there be neither Platonists, nor Stoics, nor Peripatetics, nor Theoretics, nor Pythagoreans, this knowledge being one. I wish to tell you why it has become many-headed." So there's many ideas just packed in this one quote. One is that philosophy is honorable, and I think we can clearly see that in this Chinese philosophy, the ancient Chinese philosophy, very honorable, in accord with proper morals, with proper understanding of man, in maybe more general terms than we use in our dogmatic classes, but it's still, considering that this is ancient China and that long ago, it's quite astonishing to see. And we can also see it leads us to a higher principle, which ultimately should lead us to God. And we can see that this philosophy was working towards that end. And that's probably why it was sent down. God enlightens all, including not only the Israel nation, but also pagan cultures. And they were all probably given their own set of doctrines by which to follow, by which to lead them to God. And that this knowledge is one, the last bolded point. This also accords with that. The idea that our knowledge of God was actually singular. It was unified and more complete before the fall, and then after the fall, it shatters into many pieces, and you get different thinkers, different cultures, all having little fragments of it. This is the idea of the logos spermatikos, or spermatikos logos, that St. Justin and many other church fathers talk about, the idea that God, the logos, the word, planted seeds of reason and knowledge of the truth in all cultures, in all nations, and that would lead them to God if they cultivated them. So that accords with this research into Chinese philosophy that we've done. I also want to cite St. Gregory the Theologian, who is one of the most famous philosophers and theologians at the same time. He says, "And as we have compounded healthful drugs from certain of the reptiles, so from secular literature we have received principles of inquiry and speculation, while we have rejected their idolatry, terror, and pit of destruction. Nay, even these have aided us in our religion by our perception of the contrast between what is worse and what is better, by gaining strength for our doctrine from the weakness of theirs." So Chinese philosophy, as we think of it under the umbrella of secular literature, non-church literature, we can receive principles that are useful from them. We saw many quotes that were very practical, and the church has done this before with Stoics and with other pagan religions, is taking what's good from them. And these can aid us in a religion. But also we can compare and contrast and use that comparison to see what's good and what's bad in the opposing, in the other religion, but also to understand more closely and in more detail our own truths that we hold, that we sometimes need some provoking to understand better. So I think that's a very useful quote for understanding the value of Chinese philosophy for the church. Now this is just a smattering of ideas, and not all of them, but these are ideas that I noted down that were present in these Chinese philosophical works. There's notions of transcendence and immanence present at the same time. This is very unique to Orthodoxy. There's the idea of the superiority of humility in the Tao Te Ching. There's the idea of wisdom beyond human knowledge. There's the focus on tradition over progressivism. This is an ancient Far Eastern sort of idea that was very strong throughout the centuries and millennia, and only very recently it's been sort of dissolved, but they always upheld tradition over progress and innovation. They always were trying to find something back to follow, which perhaps is because these ancient traditions were superior and they kind of intuitively knew it. There's the idea of self-sacrifice that we saw, which is very notable. The cultivation of virtues and dispassion, which we saw in much detail. The way of heaven, which if we understand the way with the proper context, we see that it was very close to what we understand as the way of heaven. And their goal of harmony and peace in all creation. Now, we don't know to to what extent that we can understand that universally or beyond time as Orthodox truly understand it, but it's at least in the right direction. It's a very good principle to take from them and that we can accept from their teachings. So as you can see, there's a huge pile, and there's a lot more that I could add there, but it would be overwhelming for the slide, that are very useful ideas and very valid ideas that we see in ancient Chinese philosophy. Now, as for how to deal with it, we have a few different approaches. And sorry, the text, I think the font may have changed colors in the conversion, but St. Basil the Great says of taking from philosophies, we should despoil them like we despoiled the Egyptians. It's very dramatic. And St. Gregory is a bit more mellow. He says, take the roses, but clip the thorns. So he's, you can see he's more mellow of a personality. I think they're both valid, but actually, if you think about, this is in the context of Greek philosophy, pagan philosophies of the time, which were actually quite different and quite oppositional with their idolatry and pagan worship. But as we saw, the ancient Chinese philosophy was much more, I guess, overlapping with what we see in our own theology. So I would liken it more to this image, which I just made with Google Images, essentially. But if you think about it, the top is like a mound of dandelions. And it's like, okay, these are nice flowers, but they're not really flowers. They're kind of weeds. And it's like, that's like the modern perception of Chinese philosophy. It's like, be like water. It's like, okay, that sounds nice and, like kind of like a higher, hippie saying, and it sounds nice, but there's really not much depth to it. So we can take some of these things from what the modern perception of Chinese philosophy is, and it's not very worthwhile because, they're not very deep. But if you do dig deeper, which it seems like no one does, to the ancient philosophy, we actually find a huge pile of gold, a huge pile of treasures, which we can then despoil, as St. Basil suggests, because there's a lot of these ancient ideas, as we saw in the Shang Shu, these ancient documents of antiquity, help with the contextualization of the later philosophical texts and help us understand that there's actually a lot of the truth embedded in this ancient Chinese philosophy. And we Orthodox are actually in the best position to mine those truths, because other people trying to read these things really don't understand them. They really just try to make up things to translate them. So I think the Orthodox perspective is actually the hermeneutical key to unlock that box of treasures down there. And with that, I thank everyone for their support, for helping me research.
Thank you very much for a very inspiring and enlightening talk. Enlightening on more than one level. Brother, would you say this is a philosophy of the mind or the heart, above all?
That's a good point. When we saw that quote, when it said the emperor was saying, I will search on my thoughts with God's mind, the actual word in Chinese was heart. So the heart is actually the center of the being for the ancient Chinese, and it actually has the connotation we would have with mind or nous, the central part from which originate the feelings and the thoughts, all originate from the heart. So I think it is of the heart in the truest sense, in the way that church fathers understand it too. The heart is the center, is where the nous is located, and the goal is prayer of the heart. And so the heart is central, and I think that's what I recognize whenever they talked about inner things, they're talking about fixing the heart, essentially cultivating the heart, nourishing the heart.
Hello, thanks, Brother Jeffrey, for the excellent talk. There's just something really early that was mentioned, and I was wondering if you could say more about, which is the idea of the virtue of sincerity. That's something I've encountered when reading about Chinese philosophy. They talk about stuff like spontaneity and sincerity as virtues. And maybe that does exist in Christian sources. I don't know if I've seen it discussed, and I was wondering if there's anything you can say about that.
Thank you for that question. It is, I would love to answer it fully, but I actually, when I was building the presentation, I thought to include that, but it would have been like 40 slides, because this idea of sincerity is actually one of the most striking concepts that I found that I cannot understand, and so I left it out. And no one could understand it. Not even all the ancient scholars, no one actually understood. There's this word for sincerity that we take now that means sincerity, but it clearly meant something bigger for these ancient philosophers. And they talk about, if you have sincerity, you unite heaven and earth. You become, you become greater than all creation. You essentially include all creation in you. All these ideas, it sounded like deification to me. It sounded like Christ, but it was using the word sincerity. And I was just so confused, because I couldn't make sense of it. And the Oxford scholar, he's read through hundreds of commentaries of ancient Chinese commentaries all the way up until his time, which was the 1800s. So he was reading thousands of years of commentary, and he said, like, no one ever figured out what this actually meant. And he himself, when he was commentating on this translation, he was absolutely dumbstruck. He was like complaining that it made no sense in his translation. He was like, okay, he's going on about sincerity again. Again, it makes no sense. It's kind of annoying. It's like, why does he keep talking about this in his translation? So I wish I could talk more about it, but I think there is more to the word like that. That's what the character that sincerity was referring to in that slide. There's a lot more to that character than just the word sincerity, but it's unknown. But again, as I said in my presentation, if we really approach this research from an Orthodox perspective, I'm sure we could mine it out with time and with finding out the context clues of how it applies to their goal in life. I think we could find out more about it. But as far as I know, it's the only thing I could find superficially was its connection to this idea of repentance. So my initial hunch was that it meant like contrition or something, or purity. But when I tried to apply those, like fill in the blank, it just didn't work for some examples. So it's elusive. So the question was, what about monastic simplicity? What about that? I thought about simplicity too. That was one of my first hypotheses, but it didn't fit all the examples. So it can fit some, but then you try some more examples of words cited, and it just doesn't make sense. So again, it's elusive. Yeah, it could be a combination. I mean, the Chinese. One interesting thing about Chinese language is it's more ambiguous. It's more capable of holding ambiguity, containing it within its language. And so one scholar notes that Chinese thinking is very correlative in the sense that it's not subordinative like Western style thinking, where things are more like sequential and that things have to mean what they mean, and then you can make a logical deduction. The ancient Chinese thinking was more correlative, as in they could hold all these things, even contraries, at the same time as true. And just because they were associated with each other, they kept them all in their mind, and that these poems would essentially evoke all these associations at once. And then by context and by the structure of the poem itself, as you saw, they're very structured poems. You can actually deduce the meaning of them. So I think it requires a more proper phoneme mindset, like an ancient Chinese mindset, that type of thinking.
These texts that we have seen, the earlier text that you showed us, is that the closest thing we have to religious texts of that era and that culture, or is there more theological writings from that time, so we know more about their actual religious practices and beliefs?
There's a book of rites, which is talking about ritual. I didn't even look into it because I didn't have enough time, but I think that was much later. The oldest book, I think, is actually the book of poetry. And you saw one citation in the book of poetry. It says, actually in the works of Mencius, there's tons of quotes where it says, in the book of poetry, it says, yada, yada, yada. And it almost reads like a church father quoting the Psalms. In the Psalms, it says so. And this book of poetry has a lot of very concise, but also ambiguous phrases, but in poetic form, talking about essentially what these ancient governments in China held as important, and they recorded down as poems. And there's actually, again, an official position of music or poetry, a director essentially, who would go throughout the regions and collect the highest quality poems and compile them and also distribute them. So it seems like in very ancient China, there was an appreciation of poetry as a use for disseminating values and retaining them in your memory, and then having kids remember them too because they're fun. And then so there's this collection and also distribution such that even local regions had compilations of poetry from other local regions of like their ancient wisdom. And I didn't read any of these. I didn't actually go through the text itself, but there's so many quotes that I saw things that do contain theology, like theological ideas, but it's also highly allegorical. And one thing we'll notice also in Chinese interpretation of their writings is it's very allegorical. They're very comfortable with that. In fact, their poetry throughout the ages, and even in their golden age of poetry later in the 7th century AD, it's all very allegorical. It plays on structure, it plays on allegory, it plays on imagery, so it's very, it's comfortable with going beyond the literal. Was it understood as religious texts? I think in the sense of principles or theology, if you can call it theology, yes. But in terms of like ritual, it doesn't seem like their poems dealt with ritual, like actual acts much. They're more like using imagery and stories to convey higher principles.
So you gave excellent presentation regarding their understanding of virtues. Did the ancient Chinese have a sense of what evil comes from, or personal, a personified devil?
No, they did not have a personified devil. They didn't have I didn't see much about evil at all as like an active force. I didn't see much about, it's noticeably missing is any idea of the underworld or of the bad outcome if you're not virtuous. They only talk about being virtuous and living in peace. They don't talk about what happens if you don't do that. So it's kind of just noticeably absent. They have idea of spirits, but their idea of spirits is very neutral, and it's also very ambiguous, because we can't, in some interpretations, the spirit is seen as like the spirit of a higher being, like God, like present. And in some interpretations, they see the spirits of like entities in everything, like in the mountains and the rivers and so on. And so it's ambiguous. And again, that's something I didn't look into too much, but could be done with an Orthodox perspective to see what exactly he was getting at when he talked about spirits so much, talking about Confucius. The Taoist text mentions spirits as well, but yeah, this idea of evil is noticeably absent. The only quote I can think of is at one point he says that what is wrong is the echo and something like the echo and shadow of the good. It was quoted in one passage, and I noted that was the only instance I saw that, which we can understand as evil as a privation of good.
Thank you, Brother Jeffrey, for the lecture. One moment in your presentation that actually drew my mind to wonder what else they thought about evil was when, I can't remember who it was, but he said, "A persecutor, what can he do to me?" And he was talking about how basically, in the way that you described it, made me think like he had a really clear understanding of God being all-powerful over evil. And it brought to mind this sense of like, it also connected with the time that he prayed for the rain, that somebody prayed for the rain, and that they prayed not just, "Oh, please give me rain," but they prayed in repentance. And so it showed to me an understanding that that their sin had the result of hardship, and that the sins of others, which cause hardship for them, could be overcome through repentance and through the invocation of God's mercy. So I was kind of wondering I was going to ask if you saw anything else like that.
Yes, actually, and thank you for bringing that up. Yeah, if you think about evil in that sense, there is mentions of evil as in something to repent for, something to take on the guilt for in certain situations of those emperors who are really virtuous. I think, from what I remember, I think there was this idea of the mandate of heaven, which is very closely related to that. And I didn't cover it too much because it's a whole independent idea, essentially, or is it independent? We don't know, but I didn't cover that theme. But it's a whole theme itself. Mandate of heaven is talked about so many times in relation to heaven itself. The mandate of heaven is what created human nature. It's what created the passion. It's what appointed the passions. It's what is very hard to follow, that if you don't follow it, you have to purify yourself to appear before God. So it seems like almost like they had this idea, which they never really explicitly talked about or described. There's some sort of commandment or mandate of heaven, as they call it, that they were obligated to follow if they were to want to rule and live in peace and live in prosperity in their mind and find a good end. And that if you didn't follow that, then you would not find that good end, which would be bad. And so it seems like it's tied to this commandment that they got, that they understood implicitly, but they never really described it, other than that it's really, we can assume it's pretty much the way of heaven that they talk about. So to live virtuously, that's synonymous with the mandate.
Well, it's somewhat connected in terms of the mandate of heaven and that understanding that how we're supposed to be comes from something else, basically from something that leads you in that way. I was thinking about the emperors that you were discussing in the beginning, and you quoted a part where the emperor is expressing that he takes on the sins, basically, in my language. He takes on the sins of his people, and then he has to repent for them. But later in the quote, a part that you didn't read out loud but was written there, is about the fact that his sins do not fall on the people, on his people. And so he takes them on himself, but they don't take on his sin. And it just made me think about our clergy, and the fact that, of course, a spiritual father takes on a certain level of responsibility spiritually for their spiritual children's sins, and but that spiritual children, that the mysteries of the church basically and what we receive from our spiritual fathers is not tainted by their sin. And I was wondering if that concept of the relationship between child and leader, or follower and leader, exists in modern understandings of Chinese philosophy, like even within the family. Like, are fathers viewed as taking on the responsibility for their children's wrongdoing, or in a sense of leadership in other contexts?
I'm not fully qualified to answer it, but I can take a guess, and my guess is no. And I would guess pretty strongly no, because in the ancient times, as we saw in those quotes, the idea of bearing guilt and sin was almost contextually, it seemed like so they could appear before God and take responsibility before God for the sins of the people, and take them on because they were pure enough to do so. They were like sort of in a worthy state and with boldness before God, essentially, the way we can understand it. That's how I understood that. But in sort of the modern philosophical understanding in the Chinese culture, it's undergone many falls, essentially. You can think of falls of Chinese philosophy. It's utterly debased now. It's very secularized, and there's no idea of there's no idea of coming before God for sins or anything. So that would be important to tie that concept to make it meaningful. So now I think it's been hollowed out, and so what you retain is a lot of the basic Confucian values, but just hollowed out very basic, rigid structures of like how to behave towards your father. You have to care for them physically, just financially or something. Like that's how they see it. Everything's been materialized, and they lost, over the ages, all this spiritual meaning. And that's another interesting idea, which I noticed, that these ancient ideas, they're as brilliant as they are as we see them, as close as they are to our understanding, and as close to the truth as we can see, they devolved over centuries. Corrupt emperors became more and more corrupt. More people just forsook them. And there's a few people who tried to retain them, write them down. Confucius was, someone trying to pass it down. He was a scholar. He's trying to go to all these libraries, collecting the texts and sorting through all of them. And so we see this attempt, but inevitably, it fell apart. And we can use that to appreciate the church much more, because we have similar, thousands of years of history, even more if you consider the the pre-incarnation history, and it's all been preserved and relatively intact, and also it's living. It's a living tradition. If we didn't have living tradition, the Spirit of God in the church, giving life to it, we can see that no matter how enlightened they were, it fell apart.
Hi, brother. Thank you for the presentation. It was really interesting. I have a question that kind of relates to how God planted seeds of truth throughout all the nations. And obviously, this is an instance where those seeds of truth were planted in China. And it's very similar in understanding to like Greek philosophy on virtues and all of that. But I was wondering why, or if you have any idea why Christianity didn't spread into China just like it did in Greece, because obviously Greece is very Orthodox in its nationality now and its mannerisms. But China, it seems like it would have had just as much potential to be very, very Christian. Do you have any thoughts on why that didn't happen?
I do have many thoughts on that. It's a very thought-provoking question. And I remember Vasily asked me that a few years ago, and I still remember that question. So it's a very strong question, and that was originally going to be the first half of this presentation. So imagine how long that would have been. But Orthodoxy made inroads into China a few times in history, with the Russian Church in the 1700s to 1900s, and also in the Church of the East. The Syriac Church actually was a couple hundred years in China with the missionaries, Syriac missionaries. And they weren't Nestorians too, I learned from Dr. Dimitri. So there has been penetration of Christianity, but it never gained like native adherence. It was always largely foreign. And so that is it's a fascinating question. Why did the Chinese never really convert in large numbers? Because you'd think that they'd appreciate it. I have a few ideas. One of them is that these ideas from the past were so intuitively superior to what sort of it devolved into, That's why these East Asian cultures are always looking to the past. They're always focusing on tradition because they implicitly, somehow intuitively, subconsciously acknowledge that the past knew it right, and that's where the truth comes from. And such that when you see foreign innovation, like foreign ideas come in, which they see as innovations, they're less ready to accept them because they'd rather hold to their own things that they knew were good, that led to the truth. Another idea is that this collapse, this fall of these truths, these higher truths, and the corruption of this knowledge led to this materialization, as I said, where they see everything in material ways. And that was already present around the time of Christ. Even the Han Dynasty, which was like a golden age of philosophy, of trying to return to those roots, but even then, their scholars couldn't understand a lot of obscure passages, and they were already creating sort of idolatrous versions of what they were reading. And so I think that already it was so corrupted that when they tried to use their understanding, their principles to understand the truth, their lens were corrupted. And that kind of goes in accord with our understanding in spiritual life that, if you get a taste of the truth and then you fall from it, it's actually harder to, it's actually, a worse fall than if you didn't have it. If you were completely ignorant, the truth is more like, a refreshing bright light to you. But if you fell from great heights, as we saw as their understanding were pretty high understandings, then it seems like spiritually as a nation, they're in a more depraved state after that fall. That's my interpretation.
Thank you, Brother Jeffrey. Sort of following on Tatiana's question, I guess, can you elaborate more? St. Basil's quote, St. Gregory the Theologian, the church has already taken in a lot of philosophical concepts and baptized them, and that has helped the church express its theologies, or express its theology. What would the church have to gain from digging up this gold instead of, continuing and trying to, pass on the gold that it already has that perhaps isn't being appreciated? Could this be a distraction?
I think so. I think you're right. So there's a redundant effort. You don't want, in some sense, our theology is quite developed. We don't need more, different forms of Chinese words to describe. Unless you're trying to speak to Chinese people, which is one way you could do that. But I think for us, for the church in general, there's different aspects we can take from it, not necessarily to build out our theology or to take principles, just like moral principles, which is always easy and I guess good to do. But I think we could take larger principles of the way of thinking. One is there's a detachment from the world, actually. That's another theme I didn't have much time to go into, but in the Taoist texts, there's an idea of if you follow the way, the world will laugh at you. It will disdain you, essentially. And so this is a unique concept of a way that's contrary to the way of the world. And I think that's one interesting concept that we could play on. Another is that if you think of their idea of harmony and unity, it sounds kind of like hippie, like, yay, we're all unified. But if you connect that with this idea of detachment from the world, there's actually a higher truth. There's a higher peace. There's a higher unity that's beyond material unity. There's a unity that's gained through virtue, that's gained through cultivation of your inner self. And that's a path that's unexplored in the whole West right now. But the West, at the same time, has this sort of fascination with Eastern cultures while not understanding any of it. So if it truly understood what ancient Chinese people were talking about, it could be almost like a bait to catch them in the net of Chinese philosophy and to lead them to higher principles. And as I said, there are actually some complex ideas of this immanence of God in the Taoist texts and of heaven sort of being everywhere. And I think these ideas attract people right now, and these ideas of unity and ecumenism and whatever, ecumenism. And I think that since the Chinese philosophical context has this safety guard of detachment from the world, it's actually a good immune defense against the ecumenical heresy, if you think about it that way. But I'm just blabbering from random ideas.
Thank you. So basically, the ancient Chinese philosophy can be used in a apologetic or in a missionizing form to or to understand it, to then, when you're conversing with people that may be looking for truth in ancient Chinese philosophy, to then draw them into the church?
Yeah, I think so. It would be very difficult, but I think it could be done. And I only say that because this sort of cultural trend of fascination with the East, people are funneling in that direction. But as we see, if we funnel them back in history, back in time, to the ancient understanding, we can actually lead them to expand their understanding of what they're reading about, and this sort of intuition for goodness and truth that they're seeing, that's contrary to the sort of the corruption of Western doctrines that they're seeking. Instead of going to the same corruption in Eastern doctrines with like whatever the Communist Party is doing with Confucianism, if we lead them to a truer interpretation, then they'll be more open to the truth and hopefully to orthodoxy.
You mentioned that it's really difficult to find ancient texts from old China because the emperors would burn them. Now, is that a purposeful thing, or were they purposely burning these things because they didn't want people to find out about it in the future, or was it a mistake that they were making?
Oh, it was purposeful. It was deliberate. These corrupt emperors, essentially, you can call them corrupt, because they would come into power, they'd usurp the throne, and then to sort of banish away any idea that they were that they were unlawful or unjust kings or emperors, they would essentially burn all historical texts, because by the historical texts you could get historical context of what was going on in China and why this person's now here, and you wouldn't find a reason for why this corrupt king is here, and that you would see that they're following a path that's really bad and evil according to what their ancestors would say, and then you would overthrow them. So they would burn all this knowledge essentially with the hopes that they could corrupt the knowledge of the people such that they wouldn't be able to recognize the corrupt emperors. And so this happened many times in history. The worst one was the Qin dynasty around 200 BC. That dynasty swept across, that was the first unification of the entire continent, the old China, I guess, as we know it in modern times now. And the creation of this sort of imperial system that has followed since then, this very high corrupted imperial system that would always corrupt very easily. And what they did was they collected all the books from all the scholars in the whole nation, and they burned them all. And that was actually like a vanishing point. Like all these texts, there were hundreds of philosophies before then, and they all just got destroyed then. And only very few texts got preserved. And thankfully, I guess there were some elders who actually memorized by heart certain passages and were able to recover certain books just by speaking them. But kind of like the Jewish oral tradition. But yeah, it's most of the actual historical texts were burned around that time, and the texts of Confucius were only saved, or the texts of the Shang Shu, the highest documents of antiquity, were only saved because they were like hidden in walls and stuff, and then recovered later, but very badly broken. And they recovered probably, I think, up until the time of that Oxford scholar who writes on this history, they recovered 58 out of potentially 100 or more books dating back to that time. So we're actually still missing a lot, and a lot of it just got permanently wiped out.
There are different levels of missionary work that, of course, can be done, but there's one really important ingredient at the highest level. It was church fathers and saints of the church that transformed Greek philosophy. It wasn't just people sitting in cafes doing it, which is kind of what Catholic scholars try to do these days, actually, now that I think of it. But you would need a saint doing that missionary work. I think it's potentially fruitful, but we would need a saint to lead the way in that.
Very good point. I agree with that.
Thank you, Brother Jeffrey, for a very fascinating and enlightening talk. Everything seemed very interesting, but there was one thing that was kind of confused me a little bit, brought about questions in my mind that seemed a little bit foreign, maybe, to our way of belief. That it seemed like there were two instances that showed that in Chinese philosophy, virtues were categorized. In one instance, it was where there was a set of 9 laws or 9 virtues, and if you had 3, you were a good individual. If you had 6, you would be a good leader of a family, and if you had all 9, then you would be a good emperor or a good leader of a nation. And then there was the other one where there was like a certain passion that was associated with 3 different age groups. So I just would like to ask about like the mindset and like maybe why did they categorize it in this way, and whether they believe that these, in the case of the 9 virtues, whether they would apply to anybody, or in the case of the 9, and in the case of the 3 different faults that were associated with youth, the interim between youth and old age, and then old age if those flaws applied to any age, or so.
Okay. Yeah, thank you for that, George. That's a good catch. And I think we have to be careful. Well, I would say that if you read, in certain texts of the fathers, the ascetical fathers, they do classify virtues in many different ways, and some of them tend to speak more sequentially, actually. But it is good to catch those, because the virtues are more complicated than that, as far as I can tell. And they're not so sequential and simple that they can be categorized or set at certain ages at times of your life. I think what my interpretation when I read that, because they don't really go into it any more than that, is that they're forms of rhetoric, essentially. Forms of memorization, kind of like they always use like poem and songs to help memorize things. If you classify virtues in 9, it sets a limit on the number, and then you set them in sort of dichotomies, then it makes them easy to remember. And then when you're behaving a certain way, you can remember, oh, I'm acting this way, but there's a whole balance on the other side of that virtue, so I should be careful not to go too extreme on this side. So I think they are mainly rhetorical and practical in application. And the way I say that, and the reason I say that is because the Confucius, at least, was well known for his ability to be pragmatic in his teachings to his disciples. When he taught them virtues, he would say one thing to one disciple, and to another one he would say completely the opposite. And then a third disciple's like, "What? You just said the opposite thing to that guy." And then he's like, "Yes, this one is very impulsive, and he's prone to go straight into head into things, and so I'm telling him to slow down. This other one is always slow and kind of weary of things. I'm telling him to dive in." And so he's giving different diagnoses of them and different virtues. And so I think when he says that at certain ages there's certain things, we shouldn't, you could interpret it as like a dogmatic sort of rule, like strict thing, but I kind of doubt that he meant it that way. I think he was just talking at a general principle. When you have certain characteristics of your body that incline you towards more temptations in one direction, then you have to fight against this certain temptation. It's a very basic principle. So I think he was essentially just noting that, and perhaps using age to describe, to sort of show that there was totality over the whole age of a lifespan of a person. So from my reading of the broader context, I don't think these were rigid sort of things. As I said, their mindset was much more able to hold things in sort of a state of ambiguity and flexibility, and I think that's what was happening there.
Thank you, brother. I was wondering, being like an Orthodox Christian, if I want to learn about my faith, or maybe in the ancient days I would have a church to go to, and I would be taught. I would have a spiritual father I could go to, and he would teach me about the faith. Was there a structure like this in the ancient days where philosophers were able to disseminate philosophy to the lay people, or was it mostly an intellectual upper class sort of sort of thing, where the elites would learn this as opposed to the average layperson?
I think the answer to that is actually, the answer is both. I think you can see them in the text. Confucius is much more focused on the societal education of the truths. And you can see that in his virtues. They have to do with interactions, with relationships. And so he's trying to instill truth in civil society and help educate people to bring them up to a higher virtue from the ground up, essentially. And I think that reflects one branch of sort of how they approached it from ancient times. From the ancient times, they'd have princes who were, I guess, nobles, elites, who were expected to be very virtuous. They were expected to have known all this stuff and pass it down. So on one hand, it was sort of a class thing. But on the other hand, the Taoist texts show us that they focus on simplicity, on removal from the world. So there's this other sense that you don't have to be an elite or born of a certain lineage. It's an inner battle. And I think the Taoists would focus more on less on the civil aspect of it and more on the inner battle and the remote sort of hermitage living sort of style of it, and the inner spirit, like the inner battle of the self. And you could contrast two different terms they use to describe virtuous people. One is jing, which means noble, which in a lot of translations they call it superior man. It'd be called noble, it could be called prince, king. So that's would accord with more of the Confucius view. So he's trying to create these noble people and noble in virtues. Whereas the Taoist text, you could synonymize it with this idea of sheng, which means sage. So the Taoist texts are seemingly leading you more towards the creation of these sages who usually lived alone or with small groups, kind of educating each other, and more like, I guess, you know, you think of it like monastics, but that's anachronistic. But it seems like they were focused on sort of this otherworldly aspect of it, but that these two would mutually cooperate in certain points. And if there was an imbalance in these two branches or in these two focuses, then bad things would happen. Essentially, if you have too many people leaving society, society itself is impoverished spiritually, I guess, from virtues. And then if you have too many people trying to acquire merit in society and virtue, it kind of becomes like this meritocratic, hollowed out system and bureaucratic, and you kind of lose the truth. And I think we can see a similar principle in our monastics versus the lay church, and we can use that as a lens to understand it in the full, proper Christian way, which is that these seemingly contrary things are actually united in a paradoxical way in Christ.
Thank you. My question also a little more pragmatic. Was there a place where people could go and learn this? Was there like a church or a school? How was it disseminated among the, you know, the lay people, the average person?
I think among the sort of the Taoist style of thinking, the scholars say that there were groups of people who would pass down the knowledge, but in small groups. So they would be, you know, little packs of people, I guess, who would pass down these sayings and memorize them and learn them. From the civil view, I know that education was always a focus from the ancient times in China. Now, I don't know how exactly it took place, whether there were some like institutions like schools, or whether it took place in the home, like a prince was trained by mentors, which is, I guess, more likely, given the less people at the time, less institutional things. But it probably evolved into institutions, and then as it evolved into institutions, it probably lost a lot of the deeper qualities to it. So it was kind of widespread among the general populace then? Yeah, especially in later centuries in China, it became a very institutionalized thing. Like the emperor enforced Confucian learning. At that point, you can see quickly the devolution of the depth of learning, and it becomes very hollowed out. It becomes more and more hollowed out the more you try to force it on people and as a government. Yeah.
Just really quickly, thank you again for your lecture. I liked it a lot. In Chinese philosophy and also orthodoxy, there is a high reverence for virtues, especially within the Orthodox Church, of course, and they actually share some virtues. And we also see within the Orthodox Church there is a high value of the virtue of love and its interconnectedness both between people and also showing love, such as agape and also eros and the other forms of love. They actually almost coincide with union with God. Now, I wanted to ask, does Taoism or Confucianism or any other Chinese philosophy, does it place, like, what is the significance of love, essentially? Does it have the same value, or is it a little different?
Yeah, that's a very good question, because I think love is the central, you know, it's like the gospel of the gospel. So I noticed that in the Taoist text, it's noticeably, it's not absent, but it's not the central point. It seems like humility is actually the central virtue in the Taoist text. They mention love, but it's actually kind of put aside, which surprised me. But the word they used for love in that sense was compassion. So we don't really know what they're talking about. They certainly didn't talk about love much in the Taoist text. Now, in the Confucius text, he does talk about compassion and benefiting your fellow man and things that we consider like agape and love. And he talks about it a lot. So I think it was a central concept for Confucius in terms of his virtue, in terms of his system of virtues. But in terms of its centrality, as we understand it from the Christian way, where, you know, on love hangs, you know, all the commandments, there's nothing of that explicit nature in his texts. It's kind of more mingled in with a lot of other virtues. So it's harder to see its preeminence. And I think I would speculate a reason is because we have a better understanding of true love. We understand love truly with Christ. It's in Christ. You know, without Christ, love is kind of lost. It's kind of, you know, it's lost a lot of its depth. and it becomes more of a human concept of just helping the poor or not harming others, and so it takes on more superficiality, and perhaps competing against other virtues, it doesn't seem as preeminent. But for Christians, we see that love is sort of the king of all the virtues.
Well, thank you so much, Brother Jeffrey. Can we get a round of applause for him?